Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. North Korea spent the first month of 2022 with a series of missile tests, and it has been wrapping up its weapons demonstrations, with the latest being an intermediate-range ballistic missile. The State Department said the United States is moving forward with different steps to hold North Korea responsible and accountable. And at the same time, it is working with allies and other countries on further steps from here, as the U.S. keeps pushing for the UN Security Council meetings to discuss North Korea's recent missile launches. Today, we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Gary Samore. Dr. Samore is professor of the practice of politics at the Brandeis University. He served the U.S. government for over 20 years. He was a White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction. Bruce Bechtel is also with me today. Dr. Bechtel is a professor at Angelo State University in Texas. He was the intelligence officer at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency and authored the book North Korean Military Proliferation in the Middle East and Africa. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have seen a wide range of missiles from North Korea just within a month. We're not sure whether they have stopped firing missiles, but can we say we have seen as many as North Korea is willing to show for now? Dr. Bechtel?
Well, the answer to that is probably not. We've seen two new, very sophisticated systems that they also tested in 2019. One that looks like a copy of the fairly modern Soviet, or I should say now Russian, Iskander missile, and another that looks a lot like the Army ATACMS, but it's not. It's a Russian system. And we've seen a cruise missile test, a couple of those, and we've seen them test a Hwasong-12, which has the range to hit Guam. They have other missiles that they can test, including new ones, and they have long-range multiple rocket launcher systems that many people call missiles, but their purpose is really more like a rocket system. And depending on how much Kim Jong-un wants to ratchet up the tension, they have not tested their Hwasong-14 or Hwasong-15 this year. Just to bring us up to date on that and talk about past precedent, when the North Koreans tested the Hwasong-12 in 2017. After they did that, they subsequently tested the Hwasong-14 and the Hwasong-15. Now, will they do that this year? That's not clear, but certainly there's precedent for that. So I don't think we're done seeing missile tests, at least for now.
Right. Dr. Samore, why do you think North Korea conducted all these missile tests?
I think this is a North Korean bargaining strategy, which is very straightforward and something North Korea has done many times in the past. Basically, Kim Jong-un is looking for sanctions relief. And I think these missile tests are intended to pressure the United States to provide some kind of sanctions relief from international sanctions in exchange for North Korea stopping the missile tests. And we've seen in the progression of tests, as Dr. Bechtel discussed, an escalation. The next step, which North Korea is implicitly threatening, would be to test a longer range system, Hwasong-14 or 15. So I think the question for the Biden administration will be whether or not they want to negotiate some kind of expanded moratorium on missile tests in exchange for some kind of sanctions relief, which I think is what North Korea is trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. North Korea released a statement and renewed calls for Washington to drop its hostile policy toward Pyongyang, to hold its military threat, and stop publicizing the so-called diplomatic solution and dialogue. Dr. Samore, what are they saying?
So the North Korean term hostile policy is very elastic. So it has many different meanings depending upon North Korea's particular objectives. I think in this case, hostile policy means sanctions. Kim Jong-un has emphasized in his New Year's speech the importance of dealing with North Korea's domestic economic problems, and at least in part, sanctions relief would help to recover or improve North Korea's economy. So I think in this case, and in all the private discussions I've heard about the North Korean goal, the emphasis is on sanctions relief, whether it's to stop missile tests or to begin US DPRK talks. So I think hostile policy means essentially sanctions relief.
Dr. Seymour, just to follow up on that, they specifically mentioned U.S. They criticized the U.S. for saying diplomatic solution and dialogue. Does this indicate anything to you? Like, they seem to be interested in these words.
Well, the North Koreans, of course, have not accepted the Biden administration's offer to begin official level talks. Some people think that Kim Jong-un wants to get a communication from Biden himself, because, of course, President Trump met with Kim Jong-un twice, exchanged many letters with him, and so some people believe that Biden would have to contact Kim Jong-un directly through letter or through a special envoy in order to begin the diplomatic process. I think President Biden is probably reluctant to make a personal approach to Kim Jong-un unless he has some confidence that there will be a positive response. And that requires coordination and meeting at lower levels to arrange for a more senior communication to take place.
Dr. Belto, what did you think about this statement?
The North Koreans obviously want us to meet with them, meaning the Biden administration. What they want more than anything else is to have the sanctions eased. And I don't think the Biden administration wants to do that, nor in my opinion, should they. It's important to understand that these tests are about more than just trying to bring us back to talks, though. Obviously, the tests of that ATACMS copycat and the Iskander copycat are designed to intimidate the South Koreans, because those are systems that would be aimed at South Korea. The cruise missile that they tested, that's purely for anti-ship missiles and defensive purposes. But the Hwasong-12, there's no doubt that system has basically one purpose, and that's to hit U.S. sovereign territory. And I say that not just talking about Guam, but the Hwasong-12 is the first stage, and the engines in the Hwasong-12 are the basis of the first stage for both the Hwasong-14 and Hwasong-15, which can hit the West Coast and hit the East Coast, but not Texas. So when we're looking at those systems, we need to look at it that way. That was a cut and dry finger in our eye, the Hwasong-12 launch. It should also be looked at in the context of, because they have sold that missile to Iran, the Hwasong-12, and probably the second stage, for the Hwasong-14 and 15. This could probably also be considered a demonstration for their ally and their proliferation partner, Iran, because Iran has not yet launched a Hwasong-12, even though the North Koreans have been collaborating with them on that project since 2013. So there's more than just intimidate or trying to intimidate or send a message to the United States, but that is a very key aspect of the reasons behind the launch.
Right. The State Department said the United States is moving forward with different steps to hold North Korea responsible. Dr. Seymour, what kind of different steps or further steps are they talking about?
So I think there's a limit to what the U.S. and its allies can do. In terms of additional international sanctions, China and Russia, I think, have made it very clear they're not going to support additional sanctions in response to missile tests that don't break the moratorium. Now, if North Korea conducts long-range missile tests or nuclear tests, then China might be willing to support additional international sanctions, but we don't really know that. And given the very tense state of relations between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Russia at this time, I don't think we can be confident that the Chinese and Russians would support additional sanctions, even if Kim Jong-un breaks the moratorium. The other thing the U.S. and its allies can do is in the area of military defense and cooperation. And I think a question is raised about steps that could be taken to counter some of these new systems that North Korea is testing and deploying, including additional missile defense cooperation. So I think that's an area where the allies may want to talk to each other and see if there are things they can do to improve their defense capabilities against the new systems North Korea is deploying.
Are the options for the U.S. limited?
They are limited, but I think it's also important for us to note the sanctions that are in place put a lot of pressure on North Korea already. The problem has never been not having enough sanctions, not for several years now at least. The problem has been enforcement of sanctions. And you know, to be frank, this is not a Democrat or Republican thing, because every administration has done that, failed to put the proper enforcement in place. We saw that with the Trump administration after he met with Kim in 2018. The whole pressure campaign sort of came to a halt, and the sanctions were still there, but they weren't robustly enforced. And I think that is definitely an option for the Biden administration, and something we've started to see them doing, frankly. I think second party sanctions are very important when it comes to North Korea. It's how they are actually able to feed their system and get money in and send money out that keeps their nuclear and ballistic missile programs running. We saw sanctions against an actual Russian company and Russian entities in recent weeks from both Treasury and state. And I think we're going to need to see more of that. We're going to need to see more sanctions against Russian companies and Russian individuals and Russian banks that are laundering this dirty North Korean money, as well as China. And I think it's also going to be important that when we put that out in the press, that when that information goes out, this is not sanctions against Russia or China. It's sanctions against entities within Russia or China, companies, banks, much like during the time we sanctioned Deutsche Bank, or we fined Deutsche Bank for violating sanctions against Iran. It wasn't like we were sanctioning or fining the German government. We were doing that against Deutsche Bank. And that needs to be clear, because there's a lot of entities both within Russia and China that continue to help finance and assist North Korea with their current WMD and WMD related platform programs.
Dr. Samore, do you have anything to add to what just Dr. Beto said about sanctions?
Well, I agree that secondary sanctions can be an important tool. In the case of North Korea, their utility is limited. In the Deutsche Bank case that Bruce mentioned, the reason why that was effective is because Deutsche Bank has a lot of business in the United States. They weren't willing to jeopardize, and so they were prepared to pay a fine and to reduce or to end their financial arrangements with Iran. For most of the Chinese and Russian companies that are helping North Korea in its missile program, they really don't have any business exposure in the United States. So we can sanction them, we can impose limits on their bank accounts in the US or travel by senior executives, but it really doesn't make much of a difference to those companies. And frankly, the problem, I think, is a government problem. I think the Russian government and the Chinese government are not effectively enforcing sanctions. They're allowing sanctions evasion to take place. And until you change the policy in Beijing and Moscow, I think the sanctions regime will continue to be pretty weak. And as I said, unfortunately, U.S. relations with Russia and China are so bad right now that we're not in a very good situation to persuade the Russian and the Chinese government to effectively enforce sanctions.
If I can make a comment on what Dr. Samore said,
Sure.
I think a good example of what he was talking of is still on everybody's mind, and that's the fact that the U.S. was blocked on the UN National Security Council on trying to get the latest sanctions on North Korea. So if anything, I think that may get worse. That doesn't mean we should ease sanctions, though. I mean, that's what the North Koreans want.
I see. Meanwhile, what is notable these days is that the US and Japan seem to be working very closely to deepen the alliance. The Key Edge Command Post exercise took place, and this was also followed by COPE North, a large-scale US Air Force exercise involving Japan as well as Australia. And about the COPE North drill, Pacific Air Forces told VOA that the purpose of the exercise is to dissuade North Korea from military action. Dr. Bakdo, it seems like what Pacific Air Forces said is very unusual in terms of, pinpointing North Korea. What do you think?
Well, you're correct that they don't typically, when I say they, I mean DOD or service-specific exercises. When spokesmen are out there, the public affairs officers, they don't typically pinpoint an exact country. Nevertheless, I think that this is something that is kind of a no-brainer. Everybody understands that U.S. forces in Japan are there to help protect Japan against the North Korean threat, and frankly, to launch forces against North Korea as well under the Combined Forces Command infrastructure if there's a conflict or a major war. So, I mean, you're right. It is unusual to say that, but it's certainly not something that's unexpected. I also think that it's important to point out that all these missiles going off, Japan is already in the U.S.-led ballistic missile defense system, as is the United Kingdom. And something I've been saying probably for about 15 years now is that what South Korea needs to do, the ROK, is they need really, if they want to protect their population centers and their military key nodes, they need to join the U.S.-led ballistic missile defense system, because the kill chain that South Korea has right now, KAMD, that doesn't do anything to protect any civilian in Seoul or Daejeon or Incheon or Busan, and it doesn't do anything to protect one military base. It's simply going back to the 1960s and the old USSR theory of, mutual destruction. I think that it would be much more prudent if they join the U.S.-led ballistic missile defense system, and I'm hoping that that's something that talks will begin on and that people will look at seriously in the near future.
Mm-hmm. The U.S. and South Korea are reportedly mulling again over delaying combined drills to April from March. Do you sense something is different in South Korea from what we have seen in Japan?
Well, unfortunately, President Trump agreed to limit U.S. ROK major military exercises, field exercises, as part of the understanding with Kim Jong-un to suspend long-range missile and nuclear tests. I don't like that deal. I don't like connecting U.S. ROK defense cooperation, which is legitimate, with North Korea's nuclear and missile program, which is against international law. But that's the deal that Trump made. And since that deal was made, the U.S. and the ROK have limited major field exercises. Now, if North Korea resumes testing long-range missiles or nuclear tests, then obviously the U.S. and the ROK are free to resume those field exercises. But I think there will be reluctance in both Seoul and Washington to resume large-scale exercises, because that would give North Korea an excuse to break its moratorium, and it would make it much more difficult for the U.S. to convince China and Russia to increase sanctions pressure on North Korea, because they would blame the U.S. for essentially causing the breakdown in the understanding. So whether we like it or not, for now, I think the governments, Washington and Seoul, are inclined to continue to suspend large-scale exercises, even though I'm sure that has a negative effect on military preparedness. Now, if the conservatives win in South Korea, they may have a different position, and obviously that'll have to be worked out with Washington. But for now, I'm not surprised that Washington and Seoul have agreed to continue suspending those big exercises.
Mm-hmm. But this is my last question for you today. Dr. Samar, what should be the next move for the United States at this point?
So, we've talked about the importance of strengthening sanctions enforcement, improving defense cooperation between the US and its allies, including on missile defense. So these are areas where I think the Biden administration can pursue. The big question is whether they try to do a deal with North Korea. And as I said, the deal would involve further limits on ballistic missile testing in exchange for sanctions relief. And at least right now, I don't see much inclination on the part of the Biden administration to pursue such a deal. And since North Korea refuses to talk to the US, there's no venue on which to try to work out the details. But I think that at the end of the day, if the US is going to get limits on North Korea's nuclear missile program, it will have to involve reciprocal sanctions relief. But that may not happen till after the presidential elections in South Korea.
All right. Dr. Bechtel, your final thoughts? What should be the next move?
I also think that we need to look at different ways to put pressure on North Korea, something that has not happened yet, although I don't sit in planning circles in the White House, obviously. I think that it's important to look at their proliferation, which makes a lot of money for them, their illicit activities, and ways of cracking down on that. We've talked about banks and front companies in other countries besides just China and Russia as well, but those two are very big. So I think that needs to be done. And I think, something that both Dr. Samore and I have both talked about today is that sanctions are very important in that we don't weaken them unless we have a really good reason to do so. So I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind as we move forward with North Korea. If we are going to have talks, we need to make sure that we're firm in ensuring that if we're going to make concessions, the North Koreans make realistic, transparent concessions as well. And it's going to be a very interesting year.
And the US government made it clear that it is preparing for the next step toward North Korea over its recent missile launches. What will be the next US move, and how will North Korea take it? We have yet to find out. Dr. Seymour and Dr. Bechtel, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice
very
to
much.
see you in person, Gary. I read your stuff all the
Thank
time.
you, Bruce. Same here.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.